All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. We are recording live at RSA Conference in San Francisco, and joining me is Dr. Bilyana Lilly. Good to see you.
Hi, Mike. Good to be back.
Yeah, how are you?
Very good. It's been a absolutely amazing conference with a lot of meetings, a lot of insights.
Nice.
I definitely love it.
It's always
here.
a busy week. Is this your first one?
Yes, it's my first one.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't even want to tell you how many this is for me, but so Bilyana is an expert in information warfare and the author of books on Russia's use of misinformation, disinformation, foreign policy, etc. We met at the Nexus Conference last fall.
That's right.
And I am excited to be doing this live and in person again with her. So good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mike.
Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, because I think you've had a fascinating career so far.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm originally from Bulgaria. I left my country when I was 19, and ever since I spent the summer in Kosovo and I saw what a war does to a country, which was just after a few years after the bombing of Kosovo from Serbia and the genocide and the war there, I decided I wanted to focus my career on conflict resolution and the threats to the societies that I care about. Mm-hmm. And that resulted in me going to Geneva and working at the United Nations for a while at the conference on disarmament, and I was covering topics about the weaponization of states, the weaponization of space. I saw how different diplomats at the highest level interact on really, really sensitive security issues. Yeah. And then for a while I focused on nuclear weapons and nuclear terrorism because I thought this was at the time a very important topic. And that brought me to Russia, to NATO, to Oxford University. And after that, I thought that I'm going to focus on geostrategic risk and disarmament issues because I thought that these were the most critical issues of our day.
Sure.
But then we had the 2016 interference in the U.S. elections from the Russian different cyber threat actors, and there was a parallel massive disinformation and strategic messaging campaign at the same time. And that inspired me to focus on cybersecurity and information warfare and try to work in an area where I can first analyze and understand how we can fight against and mitigate the effects of all these different activities that nation states are doing in cyberspace, and not just Russia, Iran and China as well.
Mm-hmm. Some heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So I know that this week you're part of a panel discussion on geopolitics and cyber risk. What are some of the main messages and themes you hope that come out of that you want to impart on the people that attend?
I started by explaining, because not everyone has to be an expert on the topic, of course. I started by explaining what information warfare is. And basically that's a Russian strategy that includes cyber operations. And to the Russian government, that's confrontation in the information space, which we call cyberspace. And it includes cyber operations, disinformation, sometimes even protests and spreading information about different topics online. And a very important question and topic that I wanted to bring up, and an issue that I wanted to explain, is if cyber operations are a part of Russian foreign policy and Russia's strategy of information warfare, and the Russian government has been repeatedly stated that it will retaliate against the US, and one of those ways will be through cyber operations, then why haven't we seen more significant and a larger volume of cyber activity against US critical infrastructure lately? And I think typically the Russians are consistent. They say what they're going to do, and they do it. And this time there's this gap. And I think it's really important to identify the conditions and the constraints that currently the Russian government is experiencing, because once these constraints are lifted, then I think we'll see an increased cyber activity, which gives us some time to prepare. And that's what I think we should be doing right now. And we shouldn't let our guard down, because I think those attacks are coming. I think first, the Russian government is still focused on the Ukrainian theater, although I know in our news cycle we're focused on other conflicts, which is understandable, but the Ukraine war is still happening and it's still on top of the agenda for the Russian government.
Of course.
So they have focused most of their cyber capabilities, and specifically the resources of their APTs, of the most sophisticated actors, still on that theater. That's why I don't think we'll see a lot of those towards us. Then another issue is that since the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian human and technical cyber capabilities have been significantly impacted because a lot of Russians fled the country. they didn't want to be mobilized. They saw the economic uncertainty that was coming and how the West was responding to Russia's invasion. And they're like, we're out of here. So between 500,000 and 1 million Russians fled. And among those were about 10% of Russia's IT force. And if we think about this, who are the most likely people to leave a country so fast and to be able to completely uproot their lives and move? Usually those will be the educated people who speak a foreign language, who have some connections abroad, which means that they're probably the creme de la creme of the Russian IT sector. So I think the Russians have a talent shortage right now. But in addition to that, they also have a technology shortage, because a lot of the tools that Russia's APTs from the GRU, SVR, and FSB use are based on Western technologies. And a lot of those companies, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, left the country, or either completely ceased operations in Russia, sold whatever assets they had there, or partially or almost completely removed the operations. So a lot of those technologies, the software and hardware that the Russians used to build their tools, now they don't have access to it. So I believe it's very hard for them to replenish their offensive tool sets. But those conditions could be changed, because the Russians are trying to develop their indigenous IT sector. They're trying to educate more students at universities and even high schools on how to use offensive tools against critical infrastructure in foreign states. So I think we are eventually going to see an increase of Russian activity against critical infrastructure in the US. That's one of the big lessons. And I have a ton of others, but just ask me, Mike. We can talk for days here.
Of course. So, I mean, this point that you bring up, kind of this gap in Russia's capabilities right now, from the West's point of view as defenders, are we recognizing that and taking, like you said, taking this opportunity to build up resilience, whatever that means, and kind of align ourselves in terms of defense?
It's never enough, right?
Yeah.
But I see a lot of congressional hearings. I see a lot of CISOs here discussing the issues, and I think the awareness that they are aware of the threat. And I think it's about budgets and allocation of budgets, and then each individual organization. And it's a matter of their leadership to also recognize the threat and be able to invest in more robust defenses.
One of the most interesting reports I've seen in the last couple of months, I think it was Google Mandiant, kind of reclassified Sandworm, the Russian APT, and kind of reclassified them in terms of, okay, they're not just about espionage anymore or destructive attacks. Now information warfare is part of their charter. How concerning is that to a person in your position?
It was about time, first of all. The GRU is known to be able to conduct the combination of those operations. They're basically conducting the full spectrum of Russia's information warfare activities. And those also include subversive attacks. They include assassinations, organization of coup d'etats, which different GRU agents have done in different countries. And I cover that in my book about in Montenegro, in Bulgaria. They have those more aggressive operations that include GRU operatives. Specifically when it comes to their APTs, they come from a history of Spetsnaz and propaganda. And these are also actors or agencies. These are also agencies that are well versed in cybersecurity and propaganda. And because of that history, it's easier for them to blend those techniques together and actually operationalize Russia's information warfare strategy. I think we should be very concerned.
Yeah.
And one other aspect of that, Mike, is I don't know, you probably remember that in January of this year, there was an attack against a water facility in Texas that was conducted by a hacker, a group of supposedly non-state affiliated actors, Cyber Army of Russia _Reborn, but they were connected to Sandworm. And in addition to actually tampering with the water facility that eventually overflew, they also took supposedly a video of that operation and posted it on Telegram. So this is how you could spread. I think this is a good example of the types of attacks I think we're going to see going forward, how there will be an operational and disruptive component in those operations, but then there will be a psychological component too. By publicizing the information, they're trying to spread fear. To me, it's similar to terrorism. It's not the same scale of terror and fear, but they're trying to amplify their message, the effects, the psychological effects of the operation by publishing it. And I think and that is also related to my point about why we haven't seen more IPT activity. I think in the near future, we're going to see more of those attacks where hacktivists or supposedly non-state affiliated actors who still have a connection to the government, but they're not technically GRU or FSB or SVR, will be conducting operations against the US with the blessing, potentially partial coordination or some participation of those groups.
And is that kind of why they lean so heavily on misinformation? Is it chaos? And is that what they want to sow
exactly.
as part of like maybe an initial stage to something else?
Exactly. According to their information warfare strategy, there are two main objectives of why they do those types of operations. First is to inflict damage, physical damage on the technical systems of the adversary, but the second is to erode and manipulate the decision making of the adversary. So by dividing us further, by polarizing us further, by making us believe that they're stronger than they actually are, this is causing a rift in our own society and our own ability to believe in the legitimacy of our government, the power of our government, the ability of our government to lead us.
Right.
And they spread that sort of disinformation, not only disinformation, even just polarizing narratives in the form of propaganda, which means they're not intentionally spreading fake news, but they're leaning in one direction or the other on an issue and just really pushing hard on that extreme narrative.
Sure.
Let's say pro or anti abortion, for example. And they make sure that they amplify those extreme voices, because this means when the US electorate is to the extremes, we're less likely to talk to each other and actually reach a resolution verbally. And what happens? We take up weapons, we start protesting, we incite violence, and we start fighting.
Yeah.
And I think that's their ultimate objective, a color revolution on our own territory. That's what they call basically, they thought that according to the Russian government, the US with the CIA was the reason for a number of revolutions that happened across the Soviet space after at the end of the Cold War, and they blame that not on indigenous forces. They think it's all, of course, the Western powers, and they want to do the same to us, regardless of whether that was true or not in their
They seem
time.
to be pretty good, though, at hiding themselves as the source of kind of these campaigns.
Yeah. Yes or no, they are shifting tactics and they're evolving. There are some known influence operations infrastructure that we can look at, websites, specific personas, geolocation on accounts, and we can identify through collaboration among different agencies who exactly are the Russians and who are not. But in some cases it is difficult to tell. That's true.
Yeah. Do you have a sense for the resources that they put into this, whether it's people or money or time, to develop these campaigns?
They still have versions of IRA, the Internet Research Agency. They still have trolls and people on payroll dedicated to spreading disinformation campaigns in Russia and most likely in other countries. And they also work through a very complex system of formal and informal connections. I believe in a lot of Eastern European countries, individuals are being paid, activist groups are receiving funding from Russia. Whether they know it's from Russia or not is a different story. But they work through individuals as well as channels.
From a CISO point of view, which is largely my audience, kind of that security leadership, why is it important for them to kind of understand that this is happening, that misinformation is part of, an overall strategy?
So from a CISO's point of view, disinformation or misinformation about a company can have all sorts of disruptive effects and incur costs at different levels. It could be a brand reputation damage, it could be a financial cost, it could be an operational cost. For example, if there's a narrative about let's say a facility, let's say it's an energy, right now, for example, there's some information. I don't know if it's public, so let me backtrack. So hypothetically imagine that. Let's put it this way. Hypothetically imagine that certain groups in our domestic population in the US have been radicalized to think that if they, let's say, take down some energy generators in a particular town, this is going to lead to chaos and help bring down the government that they dislike.
Right.
Because they think, let's say, the government is racist or too tolerant or something like that. And they have been radicalized to believe that through disinformation. And then they can go to the actual facilities and physically damage them, so they fail to operate, and in this way they can cause damage. But they have been radicalized through disinformation or foreign influence operations, which are actually real cases. I believe we're going to hear about them soon.
So, again, from a CISO's point of view, how do they act on this information? Like, what should they be telling execs or the board? And
yes, I think there
or
should
employees?
be... First, raise awareness among your employees about what to trust and what not to trust, how to basically identify disinformation online. And I think this is important because another way through which disinformation can affect your staff is, let's say there's a disinformation campaign about massive layoffs throughout a large corporation, and it's a disinformation campaign, but the staff believes that maybe they'll start looking for other jobs, maybe morale will be low, maybe they won't be as optimal in their day-to-day business anymore, and these are simple ways through which disinformation can affect an organization. The way to manage it is, first, make sure that you train your employees to recognize truthful versus fake information, and that is for looking at the source, for looking at the content, for looking at who is amplifying the message, and so on. There are very good, I'd say, already companies that are doing that sort of training. And the second is proactively monitor the web, the internet, for any potential disinformation stories against your company, to ensure that you can catch them as early as possible before they have spread and caused any brand damage or other type, like a financial cost to your company.
Sure. I mean, I hear all that, and it's amazing advice, but so much critical infrastructure in this country, especially privately owned, small community kind of water systems. They're underwater, figuratively, about, just keeping the lights on and things running the way they're supposed to be. Resource-wise, just don't have that capability, right?
It's a real problem, Mike. And there are some grants coming from the government that I hope will help, but they probably won't be enough. And I think this has to be a multi-layered approach where the government helps as much as possible, the companies do as well, and hopefully, I was in a really interesting closed-door session today where we raised the issue with some really smart individuals. Why don't we have that sort of training in high schools? How about elementary schools? How about universities? Why isn't this mandatory requirement for Americans in general? So in some countries, this is a mandatory requirement, and this is part of their curriculum. So I think we have to just learn lessons and execute that.
Is it really? That's interesting. Yeah. What are they?
So like
younger to kids. What are they telling them?
They will teach them. I haven't looked at the curriculum specifically for that, but they will teach them how to recognize disinformation. They will teach them how to read an article, what is included, what are the factors that you should look at in an article to recognize it as disinformation or truth. And those include, like, is there a lot of emotion in the article? Are there references in it? Who is publishing it? Is the journalist or the author, does he have a history of publishing on similar topics?
Yeah.
Those are all useful indicators that we should look at when we read a particular piece of information and believe it.
That's really interesting, because I'm a former journalist. I know you are, and that whole understanding of objectivity in journalism and what's an editorial versus a reported well-resourced article or feature, it's gone almost, and everything is an opinion, and even the lines for some new younger journalists, those lines are blurred, and I don't think that's healthy.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
100%.
Cybersecurity leaders talking to execs about this problem, is there certain language they should use, or to kind of really impart this message on them?
Disinformation, especially conducted by nation states, is an enterprise-wide problem, and it can incur significant costs on the organization at various levels. And I recently wrote an article with Dave DeWalt, which was published in NASDAQ. It's very short, and it basically provides a very clear typology and language that CISOs can use when they speak to their executive board to explain the types of costs that disinformation can incur on the company, and we even included examples. So that's something I'll
Super
just send your, and it's really available. You don't have, there's no paywall. You can just look at it online, and it's a very simple, digestible language and typology that we use. So I'd recommend that article
you have to
for
speak
your
in their language,
Yes.
money and downtime,
Exactly.
and whatever it makes.
But honestly, the bad actors are making it easy now, easier and easier. I think.
Explain how these campaigns are deployed from the Russian point of view, because I know we talked a little bit about this at Nexus, how they kind of just like test it locally and kind of expand from there.
I think it's very country specific. They look at the themes that are most likely to divide a particular country. They do their research well, and they target their influence operations, specifically disinformation campaigns, around what are the most divisive issues in each country. And for the US, this is probably, when we look at the elections, abortion, immigration, probably discrimination against police brutality. Those will be topics that they have already used and tried and tested before, and they know that trying to polarize us on them works.
Why is it important that Russia has codified this as a strategy? I mean,
because they put resources behind it, and that's what's scary to me. That not that the US should do the same. I don't think we should, because I think in this I love the saying you should fight fire with fire, but in this case I think we should fight fire with water and with knowledge and intelligence, because if we start spreading our own disinformation, then we're just going to flood. There will be so much noise in the information space. We are going to do a disservice to our democracies. I think we should maintain our high integrity and counter those narratives with education, with technology. I think every platform, including X, should have their own deepfake detection, disinformation detection tools, and remove stories as quickly as possible that are fake or that contain any sort of element of foreign influence from the platforms in order to protect our elections and democracy in general.
There's that conflict, especially on the social media side, just like free speech versus... how much do we censor? It censors a four-letter word around here.
I think disinformation should definitely go.
Yeah.
I think any publication of fake information should be removed. Propaganda becomes more difficult, because then you can still express extreme opinion, but it should not contain false information or disinformation. And definitely deepfakes should be off the record. I think their potential influence on our ability to think, on our perspective, can be massive.
Yeah.
And I think especially on elections, we should not use deepfakes.
Yeah, we're in for a few interesting months.
We are, because I don't think our government will have a bipartisan bill that regulates in any way deepfakes on social media before the elections. I think that will be too optimistic to expect.
You use the word propaganda. I mean, do you see a difference between information war and propaganda from your perspective?
It is used if it's useful by our adversaries. Propaganda is usually just one-sided information that's represented in one-sided way, like an opinion piece, without representing all the sides of a story objectively, but it doesn't contain fake information specifically. That's propaganda. Disinformation is when there is an intentional generation and spread of fake news. So that's the difference between the two. But both have been used in the case of Russian influence operations as well as Chinese.
I mean, I guess we're dancing around it, but we're talking about cyber war, whatever that means. These all, components
They're
of
related,
that.
yeah.
I mean, we still don't have, rules of engagement, rules of the road in terms of what are red lines and what aren't.
Yeah.
And I mean, everybody points to the Talon manual, but I think they even admit it's not super current. So I'm just curious as to your perspective on kind of rules of engagement, what they should be or what we should be doing about developing
so much more.
Yeah.
I think our legal landscape favors the aggressor. We couldn't even agree, and we see that in the delay of any sort of regulation on deepfakes in the United States at the federal level. Some states have introduced separately their own rules, but the federal level we haven't seen really a regulation. And we also see this with our inability to agree on a cybercrime treaty at United Nations. Like for years we've been trying to create one, and we just can't agree on basic definitions. So I think our adversaries are taking advantage of that. And I don't see, honestly, realistically, I don't see us agreeing on anything at the UN level. I think it has to be done at the federal level, and at the level of like-minded nations like NATO. I think disinformation should be included in NATO's playbook, because now cyberspace is a domain of warfare, and China, Russia, and Iran have weaponized disinformation, and to them that's also a part of warfare. And I believe we should include that in our military strategy and work at the NATO level to come up with solutions.
Is there an attitude that, we're allegedly above doing that we don't focus enough on it?
I think we should educate our constituencies. Like, for example, in Norway, the Russians tried to spread disinformation and it didn't take. And the Norwegians laughed at Russia's traditional media sources, and the Russians were just forced to close it down because the Norwegians were like, this is clearly fake. Exactly. We should get to that point. We should be like the Norwegians.
Right.
It's going to take probably a generation at least, but I think we need to introduce in our education critical thinking and media literacy.
Right. Critical thinking is missing. Something happened to it in the last 10 years or so. Okay, so last point I wanted to touch on, obviously it's an election year, coming up on conventions soon enough before we know it in the summer months, and leading up into debates and before we actually vote. What do you imagine, what are we in for this summer?
So the Russians have already started their influence operations infrastructure, have activated it to try to influence the elections, but they've started, they're slower this year than in previous election cycles. The Chinese have also started influence operations related to the potential presidential candidates, but they seem to be a poor replica of what Russia did in 2016. So I think we will have most likely a focus more on influence operations than disruptive cyber activity. And I think if we see cyber activity, it will be combined with that psychological component where we'll see it publicized on social media, perhaps from the GRU if the GRU is involved, or through groups like Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. I would imagine that combination, because the Russians and the Chinese see that it's cheap to spread disinformation online, and that we are reading it. It wouldn't be effective unless we paid attention, and unfortunately the American public pays attention.
Yeah. It's really a weird time.
Yes.
All right, Bilyana, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to catch up,
Mike.
and thanks for sharing all this great information with everybody.
Thank you as always.